Norfolk and Waveney could need an extra 150 GPs in the next 20 years just to keep up with population growth. But do we need those extra doctors now? Hello, good evening. How tough is it to get an appointment with your GP? I'm sure some of you might be saying it can be rather tricky. Well, it's claimed that Norfolk and the Waveney area could need another 147 GPs to keep up with demand over the next 20 years. That's from a report produced by the Norfolk Strategic Member Forum, which has been looking at the area's healthcare needs between now and 2036. National figures also show that more doctors are retiring than those being recruited, so something doesn't add up. Joining me on the panel tonight to discuss that is Steve Bloomfield, the business manager at Norwich Practices, who also run the NHS Walk-in Centre on Rouen Road. Dr Simon Cooke, who's a GP and from One Norwich, which is an alliance of practices in the city, and Geraldine Scott, the health correspondent at the Eastern Daily Press. A very good evening to all of you. Now, hi. Geraldine, I'll start with you about this report. What exactly is it? Very much planning ahead for the next 2 decades.
It is. I mean, so this group, they're a group at the County Council, and their job is to make sure all the districts, all the boroughs are all working together to make sure we've got enough infrastructure when, you know, big new housing developments go up. And we've got a lot of housing in Norfolk and Waveney being built. And they've based this on 3 different types of population growth. The highest, they're saying, at the highest level, we're going to need an extra 150 GPs by 2036. And it's really interesting. They just try and make sure that everyone is on the same page because infrastructure is a big thing when the population is growing. Now,
looking at those numbers, Simon, does that surprise you? Does that sound about right to you?
Well, it sounds as if there are going to be a lot more GPs that are needed. I mean, there's a lot of GPs who are needed now. So I suspect that figure probably needs to be in excess of that number. But you're absolutely right with increasing amounts of population coming in, and the fact that we're managing to keep people living for longer means that we need a pool of very skilled clinicians and clinical teams within the community to look after them.
Mm-hmm. So what is the current situation? How are we short of GPs in Norfolk at the moment?
Yes, we are, absolutely, yes. I mean, I don't know the exact figures, but it's really difficult to recruit GPs into practice. And in fact, in terms of GP numbers coming through the GP training schemes, 50% of the current training scheme is vacant because there just are not people coming through who want to be GPs.
That might surprise some people. Steve, is that a familiar story for you?
I think it is. I think the challenges for someone who's going through medical school, there's a couple. If you decide that you're going to stay within the hospital acute system and become a specialist in a particular area, then that's the first thing. You're going to specialise in one area. You're going to work in one department. You'll have colleagues around you who are all doing very similar work, and in terms of exchanges with other colleagues around the world, there'll be a lot of that. So that's quite a nice option.
And on a secure one.
Yeah, and a secure one.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if you come out to be a GP, for quite a lot of practice, not every practice, but for quite a lot of practices, that means you're going to have to initially invest in perhaps the buildings, the surgery, so you may have to find money to do that. If you're a partner, you're also responsible as the management of the organisation. So you're going to have to look after all of that as well. You might employ a practice manager who does some of that, but you are going to be the person who's responsible. And then you are going to have to deal with every type of illness and disease that presents itself, and some things that aren't illnesses or diseases that present themselves.
Yeah.
So
it's not just a case of when you're a GP of managing the illness and patients that come through. The other half to it is managing the business, because all general practices are self-employed businesses whose main contractor is the NHS. And it's a really difficult juggling act to manage all of the finance, all the staff that you employ, the building, and all of that, whilst at the same time doing all the medical work which takes a considerable amount of time.
And I guess there's the location as well. Geraldine, these stories are constantly crossing your desk. Does Norfolk, a county, rural, ageing population, present its own challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, obviously, in medicine, but these stories do cross my desk a lot, and you hear from people who they are elderly, a lot of our population, and that puts the pressure on. And I mean, two very recent ones that are actually in the story that you mentioned are Brundall Medical Practice and also in Beccles, where the GP is Tim Morton. They both have recently said, we don't have enough GPs to deal with the demand that we're facing at the moment. In Brundall, I think they said they needed 5 and they were operating on 2. I think it was the same in Beccles. Both of those areas have big plans in for big housing developments. It's a real worry for patients who are already at those practices and the GPs themselves. I've got it coming at from both sides. Okay, well let's hear from Sue Vaughan. She's a former GP and from the NHS Norfolk Action Group. She thinks the number of around 150 might well be too low.
Probably an underestimate. That would be a bare minimum. But there are no GPs coming forward. The numbers wishing to become GPs have dropped dramatically. But an awful lot of young doctors are finishing their first stages of training and deciding, well, maybe abroad is a better bet. So there's a lot of those. Or they look at general practice and think that really is a very hard job. Not only is it remorseless, the amount of work that needs to be done, but you have to cope with all the uncertainty, and nobody is very slow these days to blame people if something goes wrong.
That's Sue Vaughan, who's a retired GP. There's plenty of points we could pick up from there. But Simon, one thing she said there early on is not enough people are wanting to be a general practitioner. What do you think might be putting people off?
Well, I think Steve mentioned it to an extent there, in that there is it's uncharted waters for many people coming out of medical school. Hospital medicine does come with a degree of security and certainty in terms of pay rises, employment, terms and conditions, etc. When you go into general practice, that isn't necessarily the case, and certainly for partners, if they are coming into general practice, it is a huge leap, because there are so many responsibilities that you have to undertake.
So I guess a lot of people don't realise how tough it is. Steve, when you're working with the teams that you work with, how tough is their job?
Well, it's hard. I mean, one of the new requirements, of course, that's also coming in that makes it even slightly less attractive, is the requirement for 8 to 8 opening, and the NHS wants 7 days a week. Now that's going to be extraordinarily difficult to deliver for a lot of GPs. Now here in Norwich, working with One Norwich, there are plans to make that possible by GPs working together.
Is there a demand for it though, really?
Well, and there's a big question certainly about whether you really need 7-day opening. I think there is some demand because people are very busy, work away from home and that sort of thing, for perhaps an earlier start and a later ending. But I think the 7-day thing that's not so certain, and there is even some research that shows that actually it isn't needed. But I think the other challenges that they face, if you're short-handed, you're often working very long days. I mean, there are GPs who will work very long days, and the stresses that sometimes the patients can put on you, that they make the job a hard one. There aren't.
Absolutely right. I mean, notwithstanding the disease element that comes with it. I mean, some people can be really very, very demanding, very unreasonable about it. I've been held hostage once at knife point. I've been somebody's threatened to shoot me. To the extent that we've had to have a tactical armed forces unit around the surgery. These are things that don't happen every day, but they're part of the challenge that comes around. We're right at the coalface.
You seem to brush that off quite easily. That must have been a horrendous experience.
Well, it was. It was really disrupting. The last time this happened, it was really disrupting because we had to lock down the surgery, protect the patients. It was really, really disruptive. But you just got to carry on, because we're there to look after people. I mean, saying all that, general practice, being a GP is a real privilege. I still I think it is the best job because of what the fulfillment that you can get from it and what you can give back to people, and how you can really help people at some of the most vulnerable times in their lives. But it is a real challenge, and increasingly so. And so I think general practice has to rise to the occasion and think differently about how it can address these problems. It's not just all about numbers, it's about working smarter.
I think many of the concerns that come through to me are that people love their job, as you talk about, and really value being able to help their patients, but they feel that their job and the job of a GP has completely changed. In fact, I mean, I had a GP mention to me last week about various types of guidelines. They don't feel they have as much clinical judgment and freedom to make their decisions anymore. So I don't know if that's something that's maybe affecting people's decisions as well.
Well, I think experience does count for a lot of things, and general practices and GPs are very good at shouldering risk and managing people because people are all grey, they're not black and white. And guidelines are very good for black and white conditions, but they're guidelines, they're not tram lines. So with experience, GPs are often very competent at enabling their patients to be nurtured in the right direction, and that doesn't necessarily mean following guidelines absolutely dogmatically.
Well, I will just move on to some social media that we've had, because the response we had online to this was phenomenal, particularly when we were asking people how long they were having to wait for appointments. We'll start with Paul, who says 3 to 4 week wait for a regular appointment. Emergency appointments is a callback from doctors, then within 2 hours if you need to see them. Nick says, can't get an appointment unless you tell the gossiping receptionist what the matter is. Now, I will pause on that one, because several people mentioned the challenge of getting past the receptionist. I guess it's a tough job for them. They're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't, because they need to know if people want an appointment. How do you balance that?
I think that's a challenge. I think the first thing that you have to realise is that quite often that receptionist is trying to get useful information to help them decide, particularly if it's somebody who's standing in front of them who's asking for something urgently, who is the right person for that person to see, and they're trying to assess how best to help them, and it may just be that if you really wanted to insist on seeing your GP, that you cannot do that because the GP has just got back-to-back appointments right now, but there may be somebody else in the practice who might even be better, who's maybe a specialist in
certainly not an easy job. They're not just being nosy. Well, we'll stop there for a moment. In part 2, we'll be looking more about the numbers of GPs that we need going forward, and what more can be done to maybe ease the pressure on our doctors. Do stay with us. Welcome back. Tonight we're talking GPs, after a report said we could need around 150 more in Norfolk than we do at the moment over the next 20 years. But is that enough, or do we actually need them now? Joining me on the panel is Steve Bloomfield from Norwich Practices Limited, Dr Simon Cooke, who's a GP, and Geraldine Scott, the EDP's health correspondent. But part 1, we were looking at some of the problems and why maybe doctors aren't, general practitioners aren't being trained. Let's try and solve the issue now, as easy as that might sound. Steve, how do we get more doctors to actually consider going into general practice?
I think there are a number of challenges, but I think there is much more of a requirement for having employed GPs who can come in and can essentially concentrate on the clinical aspects of the job and leave a back office team to look after all of the admin and managerial responsibilities.
So let the doctors be a doctor.
And also they don't have to find upfront money for the premises and that sort of thing. So that's certainly one part of the equation. I think you've got to make an attractive environment, part of the deal. I mean, we now at the walk-in centre, we have a full complement of 6 doctors. Now there's 6 employed doctors. But we're lucky enough to have virtually brand new premises, so it's a nice environment to work in. There are other practices where it's going to be much harder to attract a doctor in if you have to take a share in the premises, if you have to be a partner, And if the premises are perhaps a bit run down, and premises are an issue, and it's very expensive. It's a huge issue within the NHS at the moment. Making sure that practices have appropriate premises.
And Simon, if you were calling the shots and you needed to maybe redesign the entry for GPs, what would you do? What would you think should be done differently?
Well, I think that general practice training in the UK is some of the best in the world. The quality of training that you get is first class, and the capabilities of the doctors coming out of training is excellent. Once somebody becomes a GP, and that will take 10 years as a minimum from going into medical school to coming out as a practicing GP, those doctors are then enabled with the skills to do the work, but they then need time to bed in and become very experienced and understand the risk, continuity, etc., and become competent at that. So that can take longer. So GPs need time to be able to do that. They're very skilled, they know what they're doing, but they need an opportunity and time. So I think, as Steve described, by recreating a system whereby you give those clinicians time so that they can do their work, they can rest during the day, so they can refresh, so they can learn from others at the same time, and do that in a correct way, then you're going to create an ideal working environment for people who want to come and practice medicine in.
But no shortcuts. Geraldine, I guess you hear an awful lot from patients who are frustrated with the service they get. Do you feel they understand the length of time it takes?
No, but I also think that patients really need to take some responsibility themselves as well. I mean, we've got a report in today's EDP where the clinical commissioning groups in Norfolk and Waveney are launching this big self-care campaign, saying, you don't have to go to your doctor to get things like painkillers, like sun moisturisers, things like that. And it's focusing on the cost and prescription costs, but that takes up a valuable appointment as well, where maybe someone could go to their pharmacist, they could go to the walk-ins. There are various options, aren't there, where they don't 111, where they don't have to make an appointment to see a GP.
And I think there has been a little bit of a political message that you have an absolute right to see your GP.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people perhaps misinterpret that. In reality, quite often working in a practice like Simon's, there'll be specialist nurses who, for instance with something like asthma, who will work on that. They belong to special interest groups, they get specialist training. They probably know as much, if not more, than the GP might about that particular issue. So seeing that nurse would probably be better for you as a patient than just seeing the doctor.
Well, Steve, you do mention mixing politics and the NHS there, which leads us on very nicely to one story today nationally, and that's the government's plan to open up an extra 500 medical school places next year. The Health Minister, Philip Dunn, said that they're committed to giving more talented students the chance to be part of our world-class NHS workforce. Not only is this the biggest ever expansion of the number of doctor training places, but it's also one of the most inclusive, ensuring everyone's got the chance to study medicine regardless of their background, and ensuring the NHS is equipped for the future with doctors serving in the areas that need the most. And I will just bring in the BMA, the British Medical Association. They've responded to that announcement today, not necessarily particularly favourably. They've said the students who will benefit from these new placements will take at least 10 years to train and become senior doctors, so we mustn't forget this promise won't tackle the immediate shortage of doctors in the NHS, which could become more acute following Brexit. As such, we require equal focus on retaining existing doctors in high quality jobs, which will provide more immediate relief to an overstretched medical workforce. That's from Harrison Carter, who's the BMA's Medical Students Committee chair. Now, they brought up a whole load of issues there, but we'll pick up the basics of it. 500 extra places next year. Sounds lovely on the face of things, but it does take a long time to train. Is there anything that can be done quickly? Is there any quick fix?
Humans are pretty complicated, so I don't think there is any quick fix, to be honest. You can't just suddenly shorten it by a half and expect doctors to be able to perform in exactly the same way. I think what we need to do is to be thinking about working smarter and using a lot more of the resources that we know are already in the system. For instance, physician associates who are starting to come out of the training programs now are an excellent resource that can be used to assist paramedics. An excellent resource. Our practice pharmacists are fantastic. So as Steve was saying there, for instance, when you have a medication query and you're not quite sure what to do with your medicines, maybe it's better to engage with your practice pharmacist rather than the GP, because they know exactly what they're talking about with regards to their drugs. So working smarter, I think, is going to be a real component to how we do things in the future. And certainly with One Norwich, that's exactly what we're trying to do. And along very much the lines that Steve was saying there, trying to work at scale, so that we can free up time for GPs so they can do more of the work that they're very good at doing, and not having to get bogged down in the running of the business side of things, the contracting, the keeping the lights on side of things, which goes with it.
Well, what we will do now is move on to a bit more social media, because as I said, we had so many responses to this. We'll start with Patricia. Patricia said GPs are retiring much earlier than they used to, probably because of the massive pensions. Is the ageing workforce a problem that we've been seeing, Steve?
I think it is. We've recently done some research in Norwich that showed that just over a quarter, 26% of GPs are at retirement age. Over 50% of nurse practitioners are at retirement age. Now, nurse practitioners undertake quite a lot of the work that can take some of the pressure off a GP. They're very experienced nurses, which is also why they're a little bit older. But a third of the practice nurses are at retirement age. So it is a significant issue. I have to say, on the whole, I don't begrudge anyone their NHS pension, because they've probably worked very hard for it.
Very long and very hard for it. We'll hear from Val next, who says, two of the problems seem to be people going to see their GP with something they can treat themselves, or via a pharmacist. They treat A&E in the same way, and also people not attending and not cancelling their appointments. Now, Geraldine, I know you've run plenty of stories about the ridiculous things that people go to GPs about. It's something that comes up again and again. Anything ever surprise you? I'm
surprised every day. But I think the thing that surprises me consistently, and the things that health professionals keep telling me, is that patient expectations are rising, which is probably something that the both of you recognise, and that maybe people aren't recognising that not everything can be done for them, and they're not entitled to every single service that they might be able to look up on the internet, for example. No, nothing surprises me, but there are definitely some trivial ones out there.
Very often what we're doing is we're trying to allay people's anxieties and their fears, and we're trying to work out what matters to them rather than what is the matter with them, so that we can try and get people in the right place. Life is a long time, and you do accumulate lots of things that go wrong with you as time goes on that we can't do anything about, but maybe we can help people live with them. So it is a challenge, that kind of thing, but I think working smarter, working together is definitely the way forward for us to try and meet these challenges.
Okay, well, that is all the time we've got. Thank you ever so much for your time this evening. So my thanks to Steve, to Simon and to Geraldine. As ever, you can follow us on Twitter to see what's coming up on future shows, and you can have your say as well at Mustard This Week. You can also watch back all of our debates from past weeks on our YouTube channel, Norfolk Now. Have a very good night.